Ben Smith is, well, his official site on Semafor, which he founded, starts off with he's a former media columnist for the New York Times. Yeah, but that's dead legacy media. He was previously founding editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed News. Okay, we're getting more into the present. But now we should note that he runs Semafor and, to my mind, very importantly, the co-host of the Mixed Signals podcast. Now, if this were an introduction to Mixed Signals, Ben would jump in and say something like, I'm really interested to hear from Ben what he thinks the direction of, or whatever. That's how the Mixed Signals classic introduction goes. Ben's been on the show before. And we're going to talk media. Welcome back to The Gist.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike. You know me well.
Yeah. What I'm really interested in is where we're going from here. Is Donald Trump good for media or bad for media? I just want to start with the simplest question.
I mean, he is media.
Yeah. Right.
So yes.
Personified. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like a question about a god in a way. But the case for bad is he traipses all over concepts of free speech. He sues media. He's trying to instill a chill in media. On the other hand, if free speech or free expression is the ability to gather the news and the ability to disseminate it, he's a godsend for the dissemination of news. So on net, good or bad, do you say?
He's obviously hostile to independent journalism, and he is a great story. Those two things are true at the same time.
So how much fretting should be done by those within the media about the threat of Trump? I wouldn't want to not cover these stories, but isn't it also the case that the threat of Trump is really the blessing of Trump?
Yeah, I don't really see. I think that fretting is not a particularly useful activity for journalism. Like, the point is to figure out what's going on. And there are great stories happening that other people can fret about. I mean, I think essentially in particular, the pressure on corporate media to toe a kind of party line using financial leverage and regulatory leverage in places like Paramount. Like, that's a great story. And that's a really big story right now that I think, is central to what Trump is doing.
Yeah. So how worrisome is that? Do you look at the fact that he's been able to win a couple of lawsuits that legal experts say he wouldn't have come close to winning if he took them to court, but he's been able to use leverage and the reality of what the corporate owners of these media want in terms of mergers? Should we look at that as one-offs or maybe two-offs? Should we look at that as the exception, or should we look at that as, legitimately chilling and, if not fret, something that's a real worry if we're fans of free press and First Amendment?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for most of your and my careers, there's always been a group of people who would say things like, you can't trust the corporate media. Their corporate bosses are entangled with powerful forces, and so they're going to censor the journalism to serve these powerful, forces that they're making secret deals with. And honestly, that was always basically nonsense. And the people who were saying it were kind of Bernie Sanders, lefties mostly. And I remember actually when we started BuzzFeed News, I went to visit Senator Sanders, and he said to me, "Thank you for providing an alternative to the corporate media." And I was like, I don't know, we're trying to do as good a job in a different way as the corporate media, but I don't really question the independence of the Washington Post or of CBS News, even though in theory you could. They do have these potential conflicts. There are these pressure points. And I think people like him have been totally vindicated by the last 6 months. And you see both big corporations for whom news is a tiny little annoying loss-making slice that might get in the way of a really important sale, just twist themselves into knots to please the White House. And you see wealthy individuals who own publications, Jeff Bezos and Patrick Soon-Shiong in particular. Similarly, Patrick Soon-Shiong he owns the LA Times, but that's his hobby. His life is drug development. And that's where he made his money. That's where he spends most of his time. And that requires FDA approval. And so, of course, I'm sure and I don't think people are necessarily, I think people usually believe what they say. I'm sure he actually also has persuaded himself or genuinely thinks that his publication is too anti-Trump and should be more pro-Trump. But people do seem to do things that align with their business interests.
So has Sanders been vindicated, or was he actually wrong for decades and now he's in a period of being right? I think it's a little more than semantics, but
No,
what's
I
your
think,
answer
yes,
to
I
that?
think, yeah, I think that's a better way to put it.
Okay. And what's interesting is that, I mean, this is not exactly 100% true, but in general, the media that has kowtowed, the corporate media, has been hostile to Trump. The news divisions have been either hostile to Trump, or Trump would certainly say they're hostile to him. Whereas the Rupert Murdoch-owned news, there's a whole bunch of different versions of Rupert Murdoch-owned news, but they continue to go hard at Trump. Look at the recent Wall Street Journal story detailing the letter, the birthday letter drawing that he gave to Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah, I think that the Wall Street Journal in particular has shown a kind of courage that you don't see from a lot of other publications. I don't think that's necessarily true across the Murdoch universe. The New York Post in particular did a kind of catch and kill where they got and then refused to, and then spiked a story that would have been mildly embarrassing to a Trump nominee, and the emails leaked and the reporter left. The Fox News is trying to figure it out. But the Journal's editorial page has offered like this very lucid and sometimes strident criticism of Trump when they feel he's violating principles they care about. And the news pages have just gone at him extraordinarily hard. Like this story about this quite creepy and embarrassing exchange with Jeffrey Epstein birthday greeting. I was surprised the way they framed it. And I guess, I mean, I'm an editor, and sometimes a source calls you, behaves really outrageously, threatens you, and you say, you know what, I'm going to dial this story up to 15 because just to like show them that's not how they ought to interact with us. And that's what that story felt like to me, because it's a good story, right? It's but it doesn't. It's not revelatory to say that Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein were good friends in the 80s and 90s and chased women together. That's like
right.
That's widely known, widely reported. Trump said it to New York Magazine. It's like, do you feel
yes,
that,
yes, and the tail end of that quote is, and he does have a taste for women on the young side.
Yeah, like, and if you think that Donald Trump's, that Donald Trump shouldn't be elected president because he was not a model of moral propriety in the sort of like louche 1980s and 90s in New York, like that's been pretty well litigated. The letter genuinely doesn't say, let's go commit crimes together. And so from my perspective, I bet my read of this is that the Journal was probably have used it in the context of a story about Trump and Epstein's long, well-documented public friendship, and the way in which Trump reacted to it and threatened them. I'm speculating here about Rupert Murdoch, probably prompted them to say, okay, we're putting just this on the front page and we are going to go as hard as we can because to show strength. And I think that's something that Murdoch understands in a way that Bezos in particular doesn't, is that the way that traditional powerful newspaper proprietors have operated is to understand that they're in a position of strength, not a position of weakness. And Murdoch does seem to understand that in a way that a lot of his peers don't.
That's really interesting. Murdoch, probably because a little bit about who he is and how he came up, understands the Trump mindset very well in a way that the kowtowing law firms and colleges didn't. He does respond to strength. I mean, I think there's a through line between the success of Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb and Trump's policy. And so Murdoch is operating like hundreds of drones in the Soviet airspace. That's really, really interesting. Yeah, I think you're right. Now, that article was lawyered up. I mean, it was written by 3 journalists and probably 17 lawyers. And there are, I counted, there are 17 instances of hedged language. But you're talking about the placement, and you're talking
just
about
that they
some
decided
of the,
we're just going to do a story about this document we found. We're not going to mention it in the 15th paragraph of a broader story that gives lots of context.
Right.
Yeah, we're just going to be like, I mean, this, the basic, the reason this is such a fun story for people is because, like, it's,
because his signature
dumbest,
stood in the place of where the pubic hair should be.
It's
I mean,
gross, and it's also just the world's dumbest revolution eating its children, right? It's these Keystone Cop Twitter and podcast conspiracy theorists in a position of power to finally reveal their made-up conspiracy, failing to do it, but in the process, reviving like the single most embarrassing thing in their boss's life. I mean, it's so dumb. And also, by the way, like, I do think it's really important that people who would like to be sane and not captured by conspiracy theories understand that, like, a lot of the Epstein stories is basically QAnon for people with college degrees. Like, there is not evidence that he ran a vast child trafficking and blackmail ring. There's evidence that he disgustingly abused young women in Florida. There is some evidence that he may have arranged trysts with grown-up sex workers for friends, or there was something like that happening.
Right. But friends whose names we know, possibly.
But this has been investigated by every law enforcement agency in the world for 15 years. It's been by every journalist in the world. And there is a kind of absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence here. Like a lot, like most of the things that people, by the way, people in both parties now have an incentive to believe. So they seem to believe it. Like the biggest picture QAnon level conspiracies, there really isn't evidence for that. And I find it very frustrating to watch people who ought to know better out there peddling it.
Yeah. By the way, if we illustrate this portion of the talk, I want to take the Goya picture of Saturn devouring his son and just say, but add clown hats and stink lines. Okay, that's a really good analysis of Murdoch. And I was going to ask you before you said he understands how to deal with Trump and stand up to a bully. What's the Wall Street Journal theory of the case such that they could pursue journalism more strongly? Is it a deeper commitment to the journalism? Is it a deeper understanding of what's really going to scotch a deal? Because Murdoch has been involved in many, many more deals than Sherry Redstone. But your theory of the case is that...
But I think Murdoch understands...
Don't think too globally about it.
Yeah, I think that Murdoch has always understood that the strength of being a newspaper proprietor is not that you're going to like micromanage and kill deals for your friends. It's that you own these like basically unguided missiles that are out there, you know, playing huge roles in the culture. And the second that it becomes clear that you're meddling and that you're subject to pressure and that you'll kill stories that people don't like, you lose your own power. And also, I should just say, like, you know, the journal editor, Emma Tucker, doing it, just like knows a good story when she sees one, and it has obviously been given full authorization to go after the hardest targets in the world.
Yeah, I remember I talked to you when in 2024. Wait, did I? Maybe I'm hallucinating this, and maybe you just said it on mixed
maybe
signals.
Maybe it was ChatGPT.
Yeah, maybe. But it was about that Siobhan Hughes and Annie Linsky story, which broke from the rest of the pack that demonstrated behind closed doors Biden was slipping. And your analysis was essentially the Wall Street Journal understands some basics about journalism, and they're also influenced by more of a European model, which tries to be, I don't know if the word is puckish, but a little bit thumb in the eye and not as towing the line. And so maybe the Wall Street Journal and maybe Murdoch has something to teach the rest of the media. Could the Wall Street Journal or the LA Times have adopted those tactics and be successful?
Oh, yeah. If people thought the Washington Post was fearless, if they thought the LA Times was fearless rather than like really worried about what the boss is going to think about every story, of course they would think more highly of those publications. And they probably, and it's also like, you know, every journalist in the building in those places is thinking, like if I get something really good, is this going to be a problem for the boss's powerful friends? And that does mean that certain stories don't get read. It also means that certain sources won't come to you. Yeah.
Yeah. There's self-censorship there. And also, when you say every journalist in the building, there are fewer journalists in the building. And I'm not just talking about attrition or firing. The good journalists are leaving the Washington Post.
There are lots of great people there. I mean, these things have their cycles, and I feel like these publications have their highs and lows, but a lot of them do kind of survive the dark eras.
But your answer, could the Washington Post have been more robust and brave, and would it have strengthened the credibility of the Washington Post? Yes, but what about the question, if you were Bezos's advisor and you got paid just to maximize Bezos's profit, would you tell him it's a bad strategy, not just for the Post, but for the rest of his empire, to bend the knee a bit?
You know, I can't think of anybody who's done more damage to their kind of public image and reputation than Bezos. I mean, he's sort of made himself into a laughingstock. And in a way that I think doesn't give him strength and leverage in dealing with Donald Trump. He's looked very weak.
Elon Musk is close, but yeah.
Well, Musk is Musk, right?
Yeah. He did start off as more of a chaos agent than Bezos was. Correct. Yeah. So here's another strain of questions I wanted to ask you. I've interviewed Jake Tapper twice about his book and about the media. And did you have Tapper on your show?
Did not.
Conscious choice?
No, certainly not.
Zigging where the rest of the media is zagging?
Maybe we just got to it late, but obviously very high impact book. And I really enjoy Jake Tapper.
Yes. So here's, at first I was considering asking him this question, but then you know what his answer is going to be and you wouldn't begrudge him the answer. And the observation is this. I did a public event with Jake Tapper and people came up to him and told him how much they love his work and his book. And they should. The book has a lot of revelations. It added so much to our understanding of an extremely important question. I think nothing about it has been proved untrue, and it reads well. So it is an accomplishment. And on the other side of a ledger, arguing for genuine accomplishment are things like #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, on that list for 8 weeks, sold 100,000 copies. And in all of the places that the elite turn to for reviews, it's gotten very good reviews. So I would say that's real. That's tangible. That's what you're trying to do as a journalist. And yet, if you look at the discussion around the book, and I'm not just talking on the most left-wing or most right-wing circles, he has been assailed. And if you just type the name Jake Tapper, a little less Alex Thompson, into Reddit, it's something like a 12-to-1 ratio of people criticizing him for what he did and how he did it. And so if I asked that to Tapper, he would say, look, all I could do is the work, and the work is the work. But my question is more of, what is reality? I mean, if this were a political candidate who came out with something tangibly good, but everyone hated it, we would say it failed. And it's media, so it's supposed to get attention, but it's supposed to also get likes. How do we know that the reality of the Jake Tapper book and the Alex Thompson book in microcosm, the reality is that this was a success that added to our knowledge and not a failure that exposed him for whatever flaws his critics are alleging?
I mean, I just think that any new piece of information now enters this hyper-partisan cycle where there's an enormous amount of partisan attacks, and they took a lot of that, and maybe some of the criticism was valid. It sort of depends on the specifics, but it did, as you say, add a lot of kind of detail and texture to something that I guess I don't really buy the idea that this was the world's best kept secret. Like I read, or that there were that journalists lived in fear of writing about it. Like I wrote about it from time to time, about how old Biden was, how it seemed old in person, how it seemed weird that he couldn't give a good speech. And I didn't actually get sort of like, sinister threats from the White House or canceled by my audience. I just think there was a sort of, I think, the White House did obviously go to great lengths to conceal elements of his infirmity. But I think there's a little revisionism about what a total blackout it was. Obviously every voter in America was totally aware of it and threw him out of office partly because of it. So they must have learned of it somewhere. Yeah.
To go back to the question, though, my analysis is, hyper partisan when someone comes out with a book that one of the two parties doesn't like, or one of the two ideologies, it's going to get filleted. So this was a little bit interesting in that it was a bipartisan filleting of the book and the sheer tonnage of criticism from both sides or all sides, or the people saying Joe Biden was a hero, or the people saying you're still soft playing how Joe Biden was a vegetable. Maybe to me, it just adds up to, wow, if everyone hates it, maybe they're right, but I got to throw that away. The question is, what are the mechanisms, and is it just the sales of the book or the elite approval? But what are the mechanisms that we can, as sense makers, say, this is fact, this is information, this is worth it. The critics are wrong.
I just think, does it add to your understanding of what really happened? I sort of go back to what's happening with the Epstein stuff right now, where there are these bipartisan incentives to indulge in just like absolute nonsense. And you see, Democrats and media figures who ought to know better, just gleefully peddling and sort of just sort of disgraceful innuendo, in my view. So I think like the partisan incentives are often terrible, and you should really think about what adds to like what you're actually learning from and what makes you smarter and what adds to your understanding, and not and not so much about like what's hitting on blue sky.
Yeah, that's a useful heuristic to me. I don't want to do the straw man of, well, all those people skeeting on blue sky are going to skeet what they skeet.
Are they skeeting? Is that what they do?
Some people call it this.
That's amazing.
If you can generate a half dozen bullet points, factual bullet points from an item that's being debated, and those bullet points are new and they're useful and they're relevant, then that has value. And I don't know, maybe we can or can't apply that to some of James Comer's hearings, right? Maybe we can or can't apply that to something else that exists in the ideological media world. But if you can do that, it has value. I'll take that forward. I think that's fair. You said you had Ezra Klein on the show, and you were talking about the first Trump administration. And you said it was also a media environment, which at least I felt, I was running BuzzFeed then, that a lot of our readers felt and a lot of Democrats felt there's no way this guy was legitimately elected. There are two theories. One, it was Facebook. Two, it was Russia. And a lot of media energy went into chasing those two things. The White House felt totally under siege from that set of questions. I think I have some regrets about that in retrospect. And Ezra, newsman, jumps on it and says something about the Steele dossier. But that's not what I took from it. And Ezra also said, and I think you agree, it's totally legitimate to have investigated the possible Russian angle. So let me stop there. You think that's totally legitimate, of course, right?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. So I agree with you. And when you said that, you articulated something that
by the way,
was
I
thinking.
should say not just the possible Russian angle, but like the very extensive campaign of interference in the election, by far the most important part of which was WikiLeaks. It was a very important story.
Yes. But those two things, as driving the conversation and also provoking the counter mobilization of Trump, very much brought us to the place where we are. So if we, looking back, which parts of it were excessive?
I mean, I think that there was a sort of, really like there just was not evidence that Donald Trump was personally working for and with the Russians, and that people believed that and sort of chased it well beyond the moment when it had really, there was just like you had to, where the evidence didn't support it. I mean, the moment that I recall, like I very vividly remember thinking like, wow, this has gone totally around the bend, was there was a woman named Louise Mensch, a former British parliamentarian who had a very sort of like totalizing theory of how Donald Trump was secretly in league with the Russians and Robert Mueller was going to save us. And at some point, and she just kept accusing people of being Russian agents. And at some point I asked Joe Bernstein, a reporter at BuzzFeed, I was like, should we just like list everybody that she's accused of being a Russian agent? And then we realized that would be defamatory. So we couldn't do that. You
couldn't do that.
Repeating
the former member of parliament
is defamation, but
maybe considered a loon by many.
But we could count them. And I think the number was like 280.
Yeah.
And we wrote that, and she had been a big talking head. She was all over MSNBC.
Yeah. Right. That's the point. When she put this out there, it's not like it was ignored.
She came by. She was doing the rounds of offices. And I remember she came by BuzzFeed to sort of like tell her story, which was very compelling in the way that these narratives can be compelling. And one of my colleagues said, because she's this very kind of put together, charismatic, Oxbridge, former British parliamentarian. And one of my colleagues said, would you feel the same way about this story if that had been like an older man with like a white shirt that didn't quite fit and like wild hair and like bags full of paper? Because that's what that was. So we did a story about how many individuals she had accused of being Russian agents. And I think that was sort of that MSNBC then stopped putting her on television. And like, it felt like, to me at least, that was when like, okay, like, that was, I guess, when I very consciously thought this is totally, totally around the bend. But there was lots of other stuff. I mean, to me, like a lot there, and you see it flickers of it now, that people with Russian names or people who like have some connection to Russia. It's suddenly like, did you know that like Sergio Gore, who works for Trump, was born in the Soviet Union? Like, what are we talking about? Like, that's just unbelievable nonsense. And it ruined people's lives. The most notable was this researcher who the one that really stuck with me, who was the one who scraped the Facebook data that Cambridge Analytica later bought for, and I just don't want to like go back into this particular rabbit hole, but it's basically irrelevant nonsense. But this guy happened to have been born in St. Petersburg, and Michael Lewis did this very moving, compelling podcast on how these absolute nonsense allegations by crazy people that he was a Russian spy, on the strength of his having been born when he was a baby in St. Petersburg, totally destroyed his life and career.
Mm-hmm. I think, though, to this day, good people, good citizens, people who really worry about misinformation and disinformation, Democratic voters, not even necessarily MSNBC viewers, still believe a lot of that. And I think that the media has not, what does this mean? But I think that the New York Times, CNN, and Washington Post, and a bunch of these other places, although the Washington Post has a columnist who did a great job on this, has not come close to making it clear a fraction of what you just said.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, right? I mean, it's a truth of media that when you get small things wrong, like if like I actually should correct, the number of people she accused of being Russian agents was 210. And if I had written that it was 280, I would have to correct.
Yeah.
But if you get like things totally wrong, like the Iraq War, like, you know, like then you don't have to correct. It's you only correct. I mean, maybe that one they did, but basically, this is my point. When you get it, the smaller, like, and like the smaller the error, the more hand wringing there is about the correction. And
there's a nice little box for that.
And if it's sort of a like, we just got this whole thing totally wrong. Journalism doesn't really have a mechanism that says, hey, we ought to write, you know, a really big correction of that. Well, as long as all the details were correct.
Yeah. I'm not sure they would say they got it totally wrong, but they got enough of it wrong that it very much hurt the credibility. I do think it hurt their credibility, and I think it hurt their credibility in ways that many people within the organization don't think it did because of, you know, their politics and social pressure. And that's why I think the Iraq War was different, that they wouldn't be able to continue unless they really addressed the yellow cake and Judy Miller, et cetera. But because of how the politics align on this,
well, the New York Times specifically did, but the whole American media, mostly with a couple of exceptions, bought into a false narrative about just a story that wasn't true about Saddam Hussein, and mostly never did anything about it.
Oh, most of the media never did anything about it, you're saying, but the New York Times did a bit about it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that credibility is why people have flocked from traditional news outlets? Because I think that my opinion is that they've done many things that have hurt their credibility, and that has had to have some effect. But I think it's mostly structural and how we get news, and not what the actual reporting or misreporting was.
Yeah, that's the frustrating part. Like, I think if the sort of legacy media had done a fantastic job and been extremely fair, they would be facing basically the same crisis of trust. I mean, and the sort of seeing their audience flee to partisan media that flatters their prejudices. And I kind of agree with you. The legacy media could have done better at the margins. It probably would have affected their credibility. But actually, like you know, the story that we're talking about this week, Donald Trump is pretending that the Wall Street Journal fabricated a document from 2003, or that somebody in 2003 looked into the future and fabricated it to sabotage his presidential term in the second 22 years. I mean, total nonsense. And the president and vice president of the United States are going to like die on that hill. So I don't think that Donald Trump is very unhappy when the media reports true things as well as false things. So I mean,
yes. One piece of evidence that even if the media had gotten everything right, they'd still be facing this crisis, is that the very successful corrective to the mistakes of the media, Substack, which allows media apostates to share their truth, has some of the most popular sites are just that. Some are arguably not that, but, it's all ideological. And some are just as fallacious as the Louise Mensch tweets, and they're unbelievably popular. So even if Substack, and there are a lot of other outlets, say we're the corrective to the media, you can go through and pick out Michael Schellenberger here or some other, crazy conspiracy theory there, and they're unbelievally popular on Substack.
I know, and with Schellenberger, it's like you can't quite tell. Is he trying? Maybe it's a deliberate parody. That's how I read it, of like the kind of worst sloppiness and ideal. And
it's like an Andy Kaufman thing, and he's going to expose himself in 2 years.
If you're it's sort of like if you wanted to do a sort of mirror image of what you thought the most irresponsible and paranoid things that the left wing or the mainstream media was doing in 2020 was, you would do it that way.
Yeah,
I don't know.
But he's also a partner of Matt Taibbi, who I'm glad he's doing what Taibbi's doing. He's doing.
I think it's been really interesting to watch some people some of whom come from like much further right than that. There's a publication called Public by a guy, and his last name I'm forgetting, Jordan something, but he, that's very concerned with whether the Davos elites are going to make us eat bugs, and also about and to me sort of hostile to vaccines in a way that I don't really understand, but also. As people sort of start to commit journalism, they have a lot of contact with reality, and they start to say, hey, wait, like, I know this isn't true. Why are you saying it, to their friends? And it's been interesting to watch that develop in some ways.
Tell me about Substack. They have $1 billion valuation. I'm on Substack. This would be the logical place for me to do the plug for my Substack, but I won't. Now, here's the deal.
Don't sign up for Mike's Substack, whatever you do.
They're making $45 million in repeating revenue because their business model is they take 10% of all the money their creators make. There's no way to get to $1 billion that way unless you have advertising. So they've said they're open to advertising, and then they got to $1 billion. Will this not make it Substack? You're very interesting on Substack, and I like to hear people outside the Substack ecosystem give an assessment of the future of Substack, either as its own business or maybe a corrective and way forward to everything else we're talking about, the media.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was skeptical of Substack and have been proved kind of wrong. Like, I think they have built this core center of gravity around this where people, independent creators, go to write, sometimes to make videos. I think to the degree they can get people making more videos, video advertising is much, much more valuable. And presumably that's where they're trying to go, is to sort of provide a like competitor to some slice of YouTube. They also have a social platform that's not bad, like that social feed. They have an app that is getting some traction. I don't know if it's too annoying to recite a conversation with one of my kids, but it's just like Substack really does contain multitudes. And I was talking to one of my kids the other day who said, "Hey, did you see that article about how all the girls on Substack sound the same?" And I was like, "What are you talking about? Like, what article? What girls on Substack?" And she's like, "Oh, like, how like every young woman who wants to be a memoirist or writer has a Substack they send to 20 of their friends." Like, okay, news to me. And there was an article on Substack about how all those essays sound the same. News to me, but sure. And I was like, "Wait, where did you see that?" And they're like, "On Substack." And what do you mean on Substack? Do you mean email? And she's like, no, what's email? Like, nobody gets email. What are you talking about? And I was like, oh, in the Substack app. You think Substack is an app? Like, obviously. And how do you find something in the app? Well, Internet Princess reposted it on Substack. Who's Internet Princess? She's like this huge Substacker with hundreds of thousands of followers who just got a huge book deal, which is just to say it does have huge, huge subcultures beyond the one that you and I are in of insane people yelling at each other about the media.
Yeah. One thing that annoys me about Substack, and maybe it's too much in the, I don't know if you want to call it mainstream, but not enough about the Davos bug eating conspiracy and not about Internet Princess, is how do they make their own stars? The business model is what I call the media martyrdom monetization model, where someone in legacy
You have some
media,
experience with that, my friend.
Well, I haven't monetized it.
Though actually,
Substack
you weren't like
around.
shameless enough to martyr yourself fully.
I didn't pivot as I'm being oppressed by Trumpian forces, but that's what Jen Rubin did, and that's what Terry Moran did, and that's what the cartoonist from the Washington Post, Ann Telenis, did.
Jim
and they all have
Acosta.
hundreds of thousands of followers. I mean, this is a playbook. I don't know if it's a good playbook for the rest of us, but this seems to be the playbook.
Yeah, you got to get into a fight with Donald Trump, man. That's your problem.
That's my problem. I fought with the wrong people, for sure. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about is...
Well, no, it's more that you didn't want to then just make a career of who your enemies were. Because I think you could have honestly done that and gotten more followers too. You could have been like, I was canceled by the woke mob and I will fight to the death against whatever something mind virus. And Elon Musk would have, retweeted you a lot.
Maybe. Right. A couple of Bill Maher show appeareances. So I
why didn't you do that?
So I cast ahead and I say, in 3 years, what do I want my life to be? And the reaction I wanted was, oh yeah, Mike, he's pretty much doing the same show he's doing. And wait a minute, wasn't he? Why did he leave Slate? That's what I wanted, right? So the last thing I wanted to ask you about was the part of your analysis with Klein, looking back, that some portion of the audience blame Facebook, some portion blame Russiagate. Actually, the Venn diagram has huge overlaps. So when it comes to the Facebook part, it wasn't just Facebook, but it was the threat of misinformation and disinformation. And this stuck in my craw, not that it didn't exist, but I was mostly worried about the government defining disinformation in ways that suited its purpose. And we saw a bunch of that, but also media defining the misinformation and especially disinformation beat as essentially just things we don't agree with. And we saw a lot of this too. I would say that Ben Collins of MSNBC, I don't know all the work he did, but the work that flitted across my radar was like, this is just stuff you don't agree with, Ben, and you're calling it misinformation, disinformation, not to pick on one person. But where are we with that? Have we moved past that? And have we moved past that for logical reasons? And by move past that, I mean getting obsessed and with the idea that we're being misinformed and especially disinformed, and it's affecting our life, and this being a prominent lens to look at media. Have we moved past that, and have we moved past that for essentially correct reasons, or just because we got exhausted and let our eye off the ball of a very important threat?
So basically, I think there was this pseudo-academic framework around fact-checking and misinformation that should have just been left to journalists to figure out what's true, what's false. You don't need some whole other layer of, well, this might be true technically, but it's also misinformation, which is where some of this stuff went, which to me was really depressing. So I do think there's some good news in that line of thinking kind of running its course and going away. But obviously we're out of the frying pan and into a totally insane fire of AI where, I mean, the thing that I've noticed lately is that there's just a level of kind of haze around information. I'll go to ChatGPT and ask them, I'm talking to Mike Pesca in 10 minutes, remind me his CV. And I'll read it knowing that it's 80% true. And there's probably something in there that's made up. You're not. I was
not National League Rookie of the Year in 1985.
Yeah, you're not from Norwalk, Connecticut, but maybe you're from somewhere nearby. The gist is probably right, so to speak. But it's not going to be factual. I know it's not factual. I'm going to a source I don't really trust because it's convenient. And I think that's true with video. I figure 80% of the videos I see on the internet are real, 20% are fake. Do I know which are which? Not really. It's kind of directional. And I think that that's really scary, that we're sort of in this moment when people are just getting used to a lower resolution around what's real and what's not.
Yeah, yeah. And how a certain kind of person protects themselves by telling themselves they're sophisticated is to not believe truth, is to believe nothing, is to throw their lot in with the opposite of truth and crazy conspiracy theories. And they could justify it by saying, oh, really? Aren't you the sucker for believing the 20% that isn't true?
Yeah, that's already in the culture. And that's the Epstein stuff to me just really embodies that kind of lazy skepticism. They're probably, obviously we all know the elites are trafficking in children, who worries about the details. And then added to that is just that any document you see, any video you see, it's like some chance it's fake. Like not a huge chance, but I mean, I remember for most of my career, I remember somebody saying to me, I would get leaked documents all the time, and I was covering politics and broke tons of news, and it was just people were constantly leaking me documents, and I'd basically just take a look at it and know that the source was good and post it. And once in a while, somebody would say to me, like, "Aren't you worried that that you're going to get tricked with a fake document?" And be like, "Well, like in theory, but I have in fact been leaked thousands of documents." And they've all been, and I've never, ever once encountered a fake document. And this was from, I guess I started doing this stuff around 2000 till like 2013, 2014, 2015. And then suddenly people are shopping you fake documents, and you have to be really careful.
Yeah. The operation security around journalism, which is not a burgeoning field, is just another cost center now.
Yeah.
Ben Smith is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Semafor and the co-host of the excellent Mixed Signals podcast, along with Max Tanney. And Ben, I want to thank you and wish you what we always say to each other when we end these conversations: may every day be another wonderful secret.
Thank you, Mike, and the same to you.